Okay, we are now recording, so I'll just briefly flip to my slides for a moment. So welcome to our weekly call on a surprisingly warm day in London. It didn't start hot, but it's definitely hotting up through the day, so I think we're in for another warm week. Firstly, thank you as always to our sponsors, DNS OAuth, for the support of the call, which is much appreciated. The theme for the week, as you can see, for the call this week, we're going to talk about round 2 of the Nominet's excellent DNS Fund. So I'll hand over to Karl in a second to just talk through that. And then after that, there's again a slew of interesting developments took place last week. So we'll touch on some of those, some forthcoming events, some looming deadlines, etc. As always. So we should have, I think, an interesting call. But I think by far the most important part of that is the sort of main order of business. So at this point, I think many of you know Karl from Nominet, who's just going to sort of talk us through the second round of the Nominet DNS Fund. So with that, thanks for joining, Karl. Over to you.
No worries, thanks very much. Let me see if I can persuade this to share. Oh, it's making me jump through fiery hoops. Hang on. I've emailed you a set of the slides just in case the Mac decided to do the how many fiery hoops would you like to jump through thing.
You know, I will be opening that just in case.
Yeah, if you've got it, it might be quicker. Actually, it's doing the you haven't presented with this application before. How many fiery hoops would you like to jump through?
Fine. It should be, I hope, on the screen. So tell me when you want me to press the button.
Indeed, thank you very much. Okay, so hi, as Andrew says, I think a chunk of you probably know me. I'm Karl Dyson, I'm Enterprise Architect at Nominet. Next slide, please. So we've all seen this. We used it in the first slide deck for the first time we did the DNS Fund. We did a whole bunch of. If you saw any of the presentations we did when we did the first round of this last year, we did a whole bunch of research, looked at what kind of things could we do that would in some way benefit the DNS ecosystem, and a couple of things came out. One of them being fund things like this, fund things that make DNS work, but that may maybe either maintained by people in their spare time, or those kinds of things. Next slide, please. So last year we very much enjoyed this. We had quite a few applicants. We awarded I think all of the money that we had set aside to do this, which is good. And I'll come on to and we'll go through a few of those in a few slides time. This year, I'm very pleased to be able to say that last year we did I think we did £380,000 of funding last year. This year we're looking to spend 650,000 in order to fund things. And the big, I suppose, last year was a pilot. We learned a bunch of things from doing this last year. And the two notable things that are changing this year are we've worked out a way of being able to fund individuals. So last year we did entities could apply for up to £100,000. This year individuals can apply for up to £15,000. And the second thing, which you'll pick up from this slide, is you can apply for up to 3 years worth of funding now. So if you know that the thing you want funding for is actually it's gonna take us 2 years to do this, you can apply for 2 years worth of funding, and we'll and we'll deliver that funding to you through that period. So last thing really to call out, the window's already open. The window closes in the middle of August on the 17th. It's very much a case of, if you either are maintaining something related to the DNS ecosystem that you think would benefit from funding, or somebody that is, please tell people, please spread the word. We feel that the stuff that was successful last year is a good selection of stuff, and as I say, I'll come on to that in a moment. But yeah, there's the URL. Please ask questions. We're running a webinar which will broadly be this set of slides again tomorrow. But if you think of questions after this call and you think, oh, I wish I'd asked, or then by all means sign up for the webinar, come to the webinar, or reach out. I'm not too difficult to find on LinkedIn and the various places, so please reach out and we'll answer whatever questions we can. Next slide, please. So this is basically the assessment principles that we go through. They're kind of a bunch of guidelines. How to phrase it? They give the idea is that they give people a guide to what we're looking for. But if you come along with something that's very slightly askew, then that might well be considered. We said last year, for example, that we don't want to be buying people hardware, and so there was kind of a principle that we don't want to buy people hardware because we wanted to try and make sure that we didn't get the funding we need is we need 20 laptops for our developers kind of thing. But you'll see when we come to the slide in a moment, one of the things was of that nature for reasons that I'll go into in a minute. Next slide, please. Some of the folks that we had on our advisory panel are staying with us. Notably, one of the changes we have this year is that Sarah Dickinson is joining us as one of our experts. I imagine you are all pretty familiar with the names on that slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do? So of the things that we can currently talk about, so there are, as you can see, only 5 of the 8 are listed. There are some others that we can't currently talk about. They're in the process of contracting. But the ones we can talk about are we funded a bunch of work that Quad 9 are doing with things like DNS dist and vector. We funded ISC to help them replace the testbed that they use for testing bind 9. We funded a bunch of work that's being done within OpenSSL for encrypted transport. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Cascade that's currently being written by NLNet Labs. So a chunk of that work is being funded by us, and also ValidNS, which is currently maintained by DNS-OARC, is also being funded for some progression and new work. So as I said, we had tried not to find ourselves in a position of funding, well, we need 20 new laptops for our developers. But when we looked at the ISC application, it was clear to us that a refresh of a platform to test bind 9, which is everywhere, it's in everything, it's everywhere. I think one of the things we noted last year was it's very easy to look at NLNet Labs or ISC or any of the the big open source, what you might call big open source DNS houses, it's very easy to look at them and go, oh, well, they must, they're writing software, they must be having enough money, kind of thing. But in many cases, what we found when we talked to various organizations and did our research was that actually the support contracts that they charge money for covers development and what have you of the existing product. But for example, in the case of Cascade, NL Labs were very grateful for having some additional injection of funding to help that move along. Next slide, please. There we go. I will stop talking, and you will be happy about that, maybe. And now, by all means, ask any questions that you may have.
Whilst people are thinking, Karl, if I sort of come in with one, you mentioned the award limit of, I think, 15K for individuals. I can't honestly remember what it was for organisations, but also the 3-year thing.
Yeah.
Just for clarity, could I get 3 lots of 15K, say, if I
So that limit, if you like, is per year. So so individuals can apply for up to £15,000 per year. So 30K or 45K if you extend that over the 2 or 3 year period. Organizations can apply for up to 300,000, so 100,000 per year. And I believe I'm right in saying that if somebody were to apply for 100,000 over and applied for it over 3 years, that doesn't immediately steal half of our 650K. I understand. I believe that that the funding has been done in such a way that funding is spread across the 3 years. So yeah.
So that's quite a significant potential sum of money.
Yeah, I mean, I've been privileged to be involved in this last year. I very much enjoyed looking at and helping sift through all of the various applications. Yes, of course, you want to be able to fund all of them. There were, I'll be honest, there were things that were, there were more things than we could fund last year. And so there's an element of we hope some of them come back. And with a bigger budget this year, we hope to fund more stuff, basically. So
and from memory, and I think people that applied for it last time around did confirm this, it's a pretty lightweight application process.
yeah, I think we did have some stats on this last year. I think it took on average something like 18 minutes to do the application. Like as long as you vaguely know what it is you're like, what your project is, I don't know, where your GitHub repo is or whatever. I think the average was something like 18 or 20 minutes to fill it in. So it's very much if you need funding, fill it in while you're drinking coffee. Kind of a thing, and we're trying very hard not to be some horrible, arduous, mountain of red tape that you then have to fight your way through. Where we basically want people to crack on and do the good things with with DNS. So
Yeah, Philippe.
Thanks, Andrew. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Hello.
Hi, Karl. I'm just being curious. For disclosure, I don't intend to apply, but I'll look at the criteria. I was just wondering whether you'd make a judgment on sort of the capacity, the nature of the applicants. As you put it, for example, from people who you might expect they'd be in a position to fund this or not. Then there's no discussion as to, or is there? I guess it's the question.
I think when you apply, there's an element of explaining why you need the funding and what have you. But yeah, everything comes in on its merit. I don't think we would assume that oh well, you're developing some large piece of very well known open source, and therefore, hey, you must be able to afford to do so. So I think we'll take each one on its merit.
Right, yeah, it's a package then. Okay, that might not be explicit, but yeah, that would make sense to be taken into account. And I think you've answered the second question. It's sort of the ownership of the output, or do you see what I mean? There's no
we
you're
don't
funding
we don't
this
want
is
ownership of the
basically,
output. So for example, there are a bunch of commits in, I think, both. I don't know if it's both Vector and DNS dist at the moment, but if you go and look at them, there's a bunch of commits in from Quad 9 in those repos. There's a bunch of commits, so obviously a bunch of commits in the Cascade repos and what have you. We don't want any. There's no, I don't know, license or ownership or anything like that. We want to see these things thrive. So
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
so yeah,
Okay,
tell your friends, come and take our money.
I will certainly. Thank you.
The only caveat, I think, Carl, but say if I'm wrong, is just it has to be open source.
Yeah, it has to be open source. So there's in the if you go to the website that was on the URL was on there. But if you can Google it as well and you'll find it and what have you. But there are a bunch of caveats. One of them is it has to be open source. And there's always that kind of, okay, well, how do you know that what you're funding has been delivered? And so there was an element of, oh, are you going to go and check the repos and what have you? Like, well, like when you tell us that you're at a given milestone, yeah, sure, I'm going to go and have a quick look in your repos and make sure there are commits and have a vague look and see if there are issues and all the rest of it. But broadly speaking, this is open source, right? So if what you've delivered and committed to an open source repo is crap, like the internet's going to tell you, like I'm not gonna I'm not gonna go and have a look and like try and decide whether your coding meets some standard, or like, oh no, your braces are in the wrong place, or any of this kind of stuff. So uh yeah, it's open source. The internet will tell you if it's rubbish, kind of thing. So
Yeah, thanks, Philippe. Anyone else got any other sort of comments or questions on this? You'll see I've put the link in the chat, which I think gives you more information as well as the ability to apply.
yeah, there's some on the link there. If you've got questions, by all means, reach out. There's a webinar tomorrow, which I think you can still sign up for. Um, uh, yeah, ask questions, tell your friends.
Well, and I know from talking to a number of the winners of awards from last time round, I think they found it straightforward and have done useful things with the money.
Yeah, as I say, it's been, I've bumped into them at OARC and what have you, and spoken to a bunch of the successful applicants from last year. And yeah, it's really exciting to listen to them, as they tell you about this. They've now got this ability to fund, to do this thing with the funding that you've given them, and that you know go and look at the commits. This we've done this stuff. Like, there are commits in the repo, kind of thing. It's really exciting, really really good to see. So yeah, I'm looking forward to being a part of it again this year.
So I suppose bottom line, Carl and colleagues have got the thick end of $1 million to give away. So make sure you help them give it away. Find useful homes for it, and yeah, again, given comments from last year, it should make a measurable difference to getting things done, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as you saw on the slides, and I think it's on our website as well. And actually, a number of the successful applicants have also made comments on LinkedIn and what have you. So tracking them down isn't difficult. So if you wanna go have a chat with folks and just go, so how hard was it? Was it easy enough? Et cetera, et cetera. Then yeah, if you don't want to come and poke me and ask me questions, then by all means, maybe ask some of the successful applicants from last year, and hopefully they will say nice things.
Yeah, well, I know I was chatting to, he's not on the call, but I'm sure it won't mind me saying, I was chatting to John Todd at the RSAC event, and he spontaneously brought up the fact that they were able to do some stuff because of the Nominet funding. So that was great. And also, as I speak, I see Vicky also in the chat corroborating that and being happy to discuss for ISC being another recipient. I remain sad that Hugh was not impressed with my idea of him just sending me a bunch of money so I could spend it usefully. He seemed to want a bit more information than that. And to be fair, I didn't have any actual development in mind to spend the money on. It was more spending it on me. But so the criteria is not quite as loose as I would personally appreciate. But I guess you can't have everything.
You can't have everything, I guess. Yeah.
Anyway, brilliant. Right, well, thank you, Karl, for just sort of raising that drawing that to everyone's attention. And as you say, rather helpfully, there is a sort of call tomorrow, so there's an opportunity to ask questions in person on that if they suddenly come to mind, or speak to Vicky, speak to Karl, speak to John Todd, or others from the community, and get your applications in by the middle of August. I've immediately forgotten the date. 17th of August, thank you. So yeah, hopefully we get another batch of really interesting projects to move forward. You'll keep that developer in Nebraska in coffee for another year.
Yeah, hopefully so. Hopefully, hopefully we'll be telling people later in the year that that we funded a whole bunch more stuff. So yeah. Thank you very much for having me on, and yeah.
Lovely. All right. Well, if pop any questions that you think of in the meantime, pop in the chat. I'm sure Karl will be happy to answer. But let me then move on while you ponder that. So I'll reshare my slides. So that was the Nominet DNS Fund round 2. So as always, I'm just going to highlight a few things that cropped up. First batch sort of DNS related stuff, principally from the last week or so. So first thing, you'll see an article from Infoblox that NIST have linked its cybersecurity framework to the secure DNS deployment guide. And the article is quite helpful, explains what all of those things are and why it might matter, particularly to CISOs, compliance teams, audit teams as well, and sort of procurement teams. So it should be important to enterprise customers, and I guess certainly federal customers in the US. Probably other organizations as well that I can't immediately think of, but at least those, which is a pretty good start. So should see some movement on things driven by the linkage of those documents. I also a slightly lighter piece that Adam Davison unleashed Claude on his DNS log, and it told him some useful things about the DNS log. And mainly helped him discover how often his Samsung washing machine was calling Tokyo, and how Amazon Echo was sending stuff to advertisers, etc. So it just gave some intelligent interpretation to his DNS logs. I thought it was quite interesting. Might be worth a few people experimenting. So that was that. I just, as always, I won't go through all of these. Since it's been a little while since DNS over Quick came about, and it's been fairly quiet since, as far as I'm aware, but I saw CachyOS has announced support for DOQ in its Linux distribution recently. So that was quite good to see more take up of DOQ. And our article, Raphael Semesi, who's been on this call previously, an academic from the University of Twente, did a piece on the Right Labs podcast talking about Italy's Privacy Shield legislation. And I also saw an article, coincidentally, on Spain's anti-piracy campaign as well. So you've got links to those. I think coincidentally, EuroWhisper put out a piece saying that rights holders should be responsible for any overblocking, financially responsible for any overblocking, sort of collateral damage. And you'll see my comment. I'm not sure that's sort of reasonable, given a lot of the overblocking is due to choices made by CDNs and others, so not really down to the rights holders, but your mileage may vary, as they say. Plenty of other things. The recent Defenders log. So David spoke to Dr. Amit Al-Azhari, sorry, my mouth's freezing out for a moment, CEO of Open Policy, just asked, one of the questions that came up in the discussion was whether policy can keep up with attackers moving at AI speed. She was quite optimistic about that. If I recall, I think partly because policymakers potentially setting compliance requirements that are more forward-looking, which can help defenders. Personally, I think she's somewhat over-optimistic on that, but it's certainly not the case that all is lost, and it was a fair point that she made. One at the bottom of the screen, there's a nice piece from Jeff Houston, just summarising some of the topics that came up during the recent NANOG event last month. You'll see AI came up, geolocation, slow pace of adoption of IPv6, and sort of latency called by SSH, and is that becoming a bottleneck? The thing that sort of really jumped out at me was the amount of build of data centers that AI is driving, and apparently for last year, there's a total of $750 billion US committed for data center build in the US alone. So astonishing sums of money. It definitely has the feel of a bubble. Nasty feeling we're going to end up with a lot of unneeded data center capacity at some point, but clearly not yet. For those of us thinking about ITF 126 in Vienna in a couple of weeks, ITF have helpfully put out a blog post summarising the 5 BOFs that are taking place during the meeting. So it's only a paragraph summary of each, but at least it gives you a sense of what each of the 5 topics is likely to cover. So there's that. And then, bottom one, the Internet Engineering and Planning Group, IEPG, which meets at every ITF meeting, usually between 10 and 12 on this Sunday morning. There's a reminder from the co-chairs that they still got agenda slots available for that session. So 2 thoughts really. One, if you're in Vienna on the Sunday morning, it's always a good thing to go along to. There's usually interesting stuff there. But also, if you've got things that may be of interest, usually more operationally biased, it's worth dropping the chairs a line and asking for maybe 20 minutes to talk about your thing. And based on the posts, there's a good chance they may accommodate you. And then, as always, loads of other things happening that are not especially DNS related. sort of range of topics. I'm not sure there's any particularly noteworthy. As I see here, Vince stepping down even from Google. So there's a nice article on Circle ID talking to Vint. Various other bits and pieces. One sort of middle of the screen from dark reading, Chinese LLMs broaden the gap between attackers and defenders. So I think supporting my sort of comment earlier that the pendulum seems to be swinging towards attackers at the moment, but there you are. And that's probably it in terms of things especially worth highlighting, I think. So I won't highlight anymore. There's plenty of deadlines coming up. So if you're going to Vienna and haven't registered yet for IETF 126, the early rate finishes midnight tonight. I think, well, 23:59 UTC, I think. You'll save, I think, a couple of $100 if you're attending in person by registering before that. There's a smaller saving for remote attendance, although there are sort of unlimited fee waivers available for remote attendance without questions being asked. And then, various other things come up. So there's a sort of public comments requested from NIST on the use of TLS implementations, which is finishing on the 10th. So that's Friday. Also, the EU is running a trusted flaggers consultation, which also finishes on the 10th. And then, various other deadlines coming up after that. So sort of lots of deadlines. I've added a few bits and pieces to this. So there's a few new things there as well. A reminder, you'll see second bullet down, the 17th of August is the deadline for the Nominet DNS Fund, etc. So quite a few things that may be of interest. I'll leave you to peruse at your leisure. The AI for Good session is running in Geneva from tomorrow onwards. Was, I think, really well attended last year, so I'm sure it will be similarly so, if not more so, this year. I think the facilities they were using were more than full last year, so I'm guessing that will probably be true. But then, as you can see, only a couple of weeks' time we'll be or some of us will be in Vienna, so that's come around really rather soon. And then we got a bit of a gap in August, and then things kick off again in September, even with OSNOG and APNIC 62 both taking place at the start of the month. And so, as well as ITU Study Group 17 Content Week in China. So just a month off, and then things sort of go back to their previous sort of pace quite quickly. Finally, next week we'll do a preview of the agenda for the ITF meeting. So hopefully most of the working groups, or the majority of the working groups, will have agendas by then. So we'll run through what looks like it is going to be of interest, but we won't have a call the following Monday, as I and a few others on this call today will be in Vienna. But so we'll pick up things the Monday after that. But yeah, we'll do the sort of preview of what's on the agenda for ITF same time next week. I think that was it from me. So let me stop sharing and just see if anyone had anything else they wanted to raise, or any questions or comments, anything that suddenly occurred to you about the Nominet DNS Fund, for example. So just give you a moment to think about any of that. Seeing anyone typing. Can't see any hands raised, so it looks like not. So, well, in which case, let's sort of finish a bit earlier today for a change. Thanks again, Karl, for coming on to sort of give that overview of the round two of the DNS Fund. I hope that's going to prompt a few applications. Have a fantastic week, everyone, and we'll catch up same time next week and just have a look through what's on the agenda for IETF 126. So see you all then. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.